Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
Here, the very day of the exams had finally arrived, and the girl was very excited as she set off for it. She ran with all speed to catch it, for she was very late. The girl looked at her wristwatch and noticed that the dance etiquette exam was starting as early as 5 o'clock. She had to really hurry because she needed to get there as soon as possible. This girl's name was Roselle Bell, and even though she had a rather bewildered expression on her face, she still looked quite beautiful. She soon arrived at the establishment, namely the Night Owl Casino. So, looking at the title, she stopped at the entrance. And in fact, if she hadn't met her father right at that moment, she didn't even know when she would be able to see him again. Her father's name was George Bella, and he was Baron of Verdun for 8 consecutive years. However, everything changed when he got involved with gambling, and it pulled him in head first. And in the end, he sold his title of nobility and even his family estate to an ordinary merchant who wished to profit from the grief of others. However, this trading behavior was certainly illegal. Their family was even harassed by the authorities for a while, and they changed their names and fled to the northern palace, namely Quartz City. But even so, it was still not the end of Rosalia's father's cruel actions. He still went on. He sold both their cattle and their clothes, and the iron cups from the house in order to raise as much money as possible for his games. Finally, he touched what he should never have touched with his hands, namely, the deed to the house. So Rosalia just couldn't believe that he actually dared to act like that. And she wasn't about to let her family sit on a cold and lonely street while he entertained himself at the casino, losing even more money. Soon, she went inside and was greeted by a man who was sitting behind the bar and was even asleep due to the fact that they didn't have many customers at this hour. However, as soon as he saw the girl, he was very surprised and said that he was very happy to see her in their establishment. Rosalia immediately came closer to him and told him that she had come to find one person who must be in their possession. When the man looked at her, he immediately noticed that she was wearing Beckley's school uniform. He thought that only children from noble families went to such a school, so he immediately thought that she was from a noble family. The man immediately smiled as he approached her and asked if he could find out who she was looking for in this place. The girl was incredibly angry with her father and said she was looking for George Bell and also wondering if he was in the area. When the man heard that she was George's child, he was very surprised because he thought she was from a noble family, not the daughter of that horrible man. So becoming more rude, he inquired what she had come for, if it was to give him his money back. Without waiting for an answer, he pointed to the side and said that if she was really looking for George, he was probably at the end of the 3rd-floor room and drinking as usual. Rosalia said nothing to him, but ran up the stairs to find her father as soon as possible. As soon as she was upstairs, she saw the room where he was supposed to be. She hoped he hadn't really gone anywhere. She stood near the door for a while, bringing her breathing back to normal, and then slowly opened it and went inside to her father. She immediately went over to the bed where her father was sleeping with some man. They were both drunk, and various bottles were scattered on the floor. Rosalia immediately started touching him, thereby telling him to wake up. Already she was just beyond furious. The man reluctantly opened his eyes after all, and when he saw Rosalia, he was very surprised and also wondered what she was doing in this place. Because of all the noise, another man woke up as well. He immediately sat up on the bed and looked around, asking what was going on. However, when he saw the girl, he smiled evilly and said that she was very cute. Rosalia became very uncomfortable with this. She even felt disgusted with the man, so she wanted to leave as soon as possible. Her father immediately got out of bed and grabbed her hand. He started to lead her out of the room. The girl was very surprised by this behavior, and besides, he held her wrist too tightly. However, they were soon in the hallway, and he started yelling at her, asking how a girl could barge into a man's bedroom like that, and also asking if Anna hadn't taught them that they shouldn't do that. Rosalia did not want to hear anything, so she asked him where the deed to the house was. She looked at him with a very stern look and wanted to hear the answer immediately. George immediately turned away from her and wondered why she had suddenly started asking him just that. Then the girl, yelling at him, said that she had heard everything from her mom. He had taken just the act home so she'd come to get him. The man didn't want to answer anything to that. So he said he had had enough, and also warned that there were rumors that if the girl went to places like that, it could embarrass the whole family. So he asked that she come home quickly. But at that moment, the man came out and turned to George and asked him why he had been so angry all morning. The man yawned, scratched his potbelly, and replied that it didn't matter at all how he thought about it. In fact, the real culprit in all this was just the alcoholic beverage called Vander LaCoy, and he wondered if it really made sense to get all these reprimands every day. The man looked at him angrily and said that he was talking, so he should go back and sleep back, since he probably wasn't awake yet. So George asked him to lie down and get some more rest. The man was fine with it, and said he would do it after all, and asked that after his conversation, he sell the deed to the house and cash out the money that was obtained from gambling on that day exactly. George immediately started yelling at him and asked him why he was saying all this without even being inside the room. Rosalia, hearing all this, was very surprised. The man also said that on that day he would sell the deed to the house anyway, and there was no way to break the spirit of that idiot. George couldn't stand it anymore and had already started pushing the man back into the room himself, telling him to sit inside and not say anything. As the door slammed shut, he turned back to his daughter again to continue the previous conversation. Rosalia was already furious and her body was shaking. She was ready to hit her father and asked him to give it all back. The man realized that his daughter was a terrible person when angry, so he put his hands up and she asked that he not fool her anymore with all the horrible excuses. Then George couldn't stand it anymore and started yelling at her too, saying that she was an insolent child, not understanding how she dared to take and swear at her father like that. Rosalia, hearing all this, was very surprised and then said that their surname could not lose this deed to the house. She also added that, of course, she would not go anywhere until she got this document back. The man smiled smugly, asked if she really wanted it back, and also said he didn't know what she was talking about, since he had bought the house himself. The girl asked that he should be serious and treat this matter with all care, for he was able to buy this house with the money that was left after his parents. And he himself had actually even left the house and had not lived there for quite some time. The man, angry, grabbed her arm and told her to be calm and stop yelling at the entire building. He called her a naughty and selfish child and told her to leave. He took her down the stairs, continuing to hold her hand. The man opened the doors and threw her outside and said she was making too much noise. Closing the door behind him, he yelled at her, telling her to go back to her academy or wherever. He didn't care. Then, Rosalia looked at him with tearful eyes and said that if her father sold those papers on the house, she would never forgive him for the rest of her life. For a while, George just stared at her, then turned around and said that all he had to do was win and get all his money back. He said he knew he could do it, so he asked that she not mess with his head and just leave. After that, he slammed the door shut, and Rosalia was left sitting in a muddy puddle in her white uniform right outside the entrance to this casino. Slowly, she got to her feet and started walking back to where she had planned to go. The girl was simply overwhelmed, but then suddenly she felt a sharp pain in her foot and immediately stopped. She took off her sock and saw a big bruise there. Rosalia immediately realized that she must have been injured when she fell while her father was throwing her out. She immediately looked at her watch and didn't know what she could do about her leg, because even if she didn't show up too late for the exam, it was unlikely that she would be able to pass it with such a complication. Rosalia was so angry that she even wished her father hadn't gotten attached to all of this to begin with. However, of course it was too late, and there was definitely no stopping him. And she thought that she would start by making sure that he didn't get a mistress. The girl walked and cried because she just did not know what to do now. In fact, Benchley was quite the prestigious academy for all aristocrats. Even if you just have a diploma of graduation from this academy, you can easily find a prestigious job in the capital. Even if you can't do anything with your experience, they will still accept you because education is very important. Rosalia thought about the fact that if this was really, really true, Her family would certainly not starve. Mother kept talking about how she was their hope. They wanted the best for her and believed in their daughter. However, be that as it may, the final exam was about to come soon enough, and it was a very important one for graduation. So Rosalia ran straight to the academy, but she felt a lot of pain in her ankle because of that bruise. She thought about the fact that if her leg was perfectly fine, she could get the best result. But as it was, she still had to arrive on time. As she was running so hard, she did not notice a stone that was lying on the road, so she got caught and fell straight to the ground. It just crushed Rosalia, so she couldn't contain her emotions again and started crying loudly because she was mentally very hard. She had told herself she wouldn't cry until the exam was over, so it was very disappointing that she couldn't keep even that promise. At that moment, a carriage suddenly pulled up beside her, and a boy got out of it. When he saw Rosalie, he wondered if it was her. The girl with the crying look immediately turned sideways to see who it was that was addressing her. And when she turned, she saw at once a perfectly handsome young man. It was Jasper Conway, namely, the Duke of Conway's second son. She looked at Jasper in surprise and didn't understand what he was even doing on this road, so she wondered if he really knew her. The man sighed heavily and wondered if he should not know her. It really surprised him. In fact, Rosalia's first memory of Jasper was when she was 10 years old and still had her father's last name. One day she attended a party that had been organized by the Earl of Bluard, and when she saw this luxurious house, she was very surprised, for she had never been to such events before. And as soon as Rosalia went inside, she saw how beautiful everything was there, and the atmosphere was very favorable. She greeted the nobles that day in a rented dress and expensive jewelry that didn't belong to her. But even with all that, she was still a child, so she enjoyed playing alone with her mom and socializing with everyone. But then suddenly, when she went out on the veranda to get some air, she saw a boy sitting in some room nearby. When she looked at him more closely, she noticed that he was rather sad. She accidentally took a wrong turn, so she met this stranger sitting in the garden. When Rosalia watched him for a while, she even noticed that he was crying. He had bright golden hair, and she remembered tears welling up in those beautiful blue eyes. But then suddenly the boy, when he heard some noise nearby, immediately looked up and saw that she was watching him from behind the door. He just stared at her for a while, and after that, he pulled a smile onto his face, even though he continued to cry while doing so. Rosalia, when she saw it, realized that he looked like a fairy. Then when he saw her and they met, he said she looked like some beautiful fairy too. But Jasper was grown up now, and it had been a long time since they'd first met. The man looked at her sternly, wondering what she was doing in this place and on the ground. Rosalia couldn't hold back her tears then and cried again. She started to get up from the ground, realizing that she could not contact Jasper again. So she replied that there was nothing wrong with that, and he could go back to his path. So she didn't want to distract him. Without waiting for any response, she simply went on her way, not even looking back at Jasper, who had been watching her the whole time. He was silent for a while, and after that he said he was heading to the academy, and if she was heading there too, she could join him, and he'd like to let her down. Rosalia, hearing this, was very much surprised, then stopped and looked at him, not realizing whether he was really offering it to her. The man looked her straight in the eye and told her he still had room and she could be there for him. The girl stared at him in surprise for a while, but then she realized that she would just arrive and that would be the end of it. So she decided that everything would be fine and nothing like that would happen. She wouldn't have been able to be on time with her leg anyway, so she told him she really needed his help and thanked him for it. Rosalie immediately got into the carriage with him, and they set off for the academy. They sat in silence the whole time, and Jasper didn't even look at her. She thought about how that was really right. He probably just didn't remember her. And now she had changed her name, and the only thing he remembered was her status as Rosabelle's top student. When she saw Jasper turn and look directly at her, she quickly turned her head away because of the awkwardness she felt at that moment. She was ready to cry again over how things were even happening, but managed to hold back. Jasper broke their awkward silence and asked what was wrong with her ankle. Was it hurt? He'd noticed that she could barely walk. The girl immediately began covering her battered knees and said she wasn't sure where exactly that injury came from. The man then just stared at her for a while, and afterward reached his hand up and asked her to let him look closely, and he would tell her how serious it was. Rosalia, hearing this, became very indignant and asked what it was that he was even saying, but he said with a serious tone that he could stabilize it, and by bandaging her ankle he thought it might help her a little. The girl immediately said that she didn't need it at all and she was really fine, but he urged her to hurry up, for they would be near the academy soon enough. Rosalia had nothing else to do, so she started to take off her shoes and thought about the fact that even if it was simple first aid, it could still be a very awkward situation. But that was really it for the girl. He immediately began to examine her leg, and after that he tied a special bandage there to compress the injury. She watched it all for a while, and when it was over, she put her shoes back on and thanked Jasper for it. She also said she would wash his tie and be sure to return it. The man looked at her in surprise and asked if she really knew his name. Jasper explained that he just hadn't heard her call him by his first name before, so he assumed that she just didn't know him. The girl at this moment thought of the fact that she did not call people by their names unless there was a reason for it, and he also added that she should not return his tie, for there was nothing special about it. Rosalia was very indignant at such behavior. After all, the uniforms of their academy are famous for their high cost. Even a simple button can cost a lot of money. So she decided to change the conversation and said that she still wanted to thank him for helping her and giving her a ride. With a smile on his face, he immediately asked what she was going to do to repay him. She said thoughtfully that anything he wanted would be fine by now. She could fulfill everything. Rosalia didn't really know what to give him, for he had absolutely everything. But she still had to thank him in some way, for otherwise it would be very impolite. Jasper didn't say anything to that, but just turned away and said that they had already arrived at the academy anyway. When Rosalia heard this, she immediately said that in that case, she wished he would let her go out a little earlier, for she still had some distance to walk to the campus. The man, hearing this, became very indignant and asked if she really wanted to go for a walk with such an injured leg. But then suddenly he smiled and asked if she was really worried that rumors would start because of her getting off the wagon with him. The girl immediately replied that if that was indeed the case, he would also be affected by those rumors in such a situation, so she didn't want it to affect both of them. Jasper looked at her carefully for a while, but said nothing afterward. Then she wondered if she could come out a little earlier in that case. But suddenly the cart stopped and a man stepped out into the courtyard. When she saw this, she asked in surprise what he was doing. The man, waving his hand, said she could stay and sit until they got to campus and he would walk himself. The carriage moved on, and Rosalia saw him moving away in the direction of the academy. It surprised her, and she thought that she had just made the greatest mistake she would ever regret. In fact, 20 years ago, engineering emerged and brought new technologies into people's daily lives. These innovations were created by the new diamantes of society and were quickly able to provide wealth to the people. In this new era, creativity and technology is what people liked the most compared to the traditional ways of using things. However, be that as it may, not everyone was in such a great relationship with the new technologies. Many preferred the old and traditional ones. And one of those people was Credo. She was a professor in charge of a middle school magic engineering class. To her, the new age of engineering was just a new invention and completely irrelevant to her little tasks. This woman absolutely never liked the commoners who took first place in her classes, so she was very prejudiced against Rosalia. When Rosalia arrived at class and knocked to apologize for her tardiness, she was in a wrinkled and stained school uniform. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked very untidy. When the teacher looked at her with a stern look, She didn't understand how anyone could come to the exam in such a horrible state. She considered it not only an insult to her, but also disrespectful to all the other nobles of the class. So the woman came closer to Rosalia and said that her uniform was very dirty and completely out of line with the dress code. Moreover, she dipped her head down and noticed the bandage on her ankle, saying that she even had a man's tie tied around her leg. The other students behind were also afraid of this teacher, so they were amazed that a commoner could muster the courage to appear in class like this. Rosalia bowed and said she had her reasons, but that was no excuse. She apologized and asked the woman to let her take the exam anyway. The teacher looked at her sternly and said that of course she could not do that. The girl looked at her in surprise and asked her to give in. However, the woman was unwavering in her decisions and said that etiquette naturally includes properly fitting clothing, and to write an exam in such clothing is the greatest insult to the subject. So the woman pointed her hand toward the door and told Rosalia to leave immediately. The student began to beg her in order to leave her and allow her to participate. However, of course, she was unable to do so, so Rosalia had to leave the classroom. And so, when she was left standing by the closed door and realized that her life was ruined, she cried bitterly because she did not know what to do now. After Rosalia returned to her room, she immediately wrote a letter about her ever-bored mother. She immediately inquired how they were doing and asked if the case about the father had already been settled. She also said she used her teaching assistant's salary to hire detectives, and fortunately, they were eventually able to save their home. She also added that she had written to her about it in a previous magical letter. Rosalia also recalled that 2 months after her assistant job ended, she thought she would already be back in their hometown of Quartz. She wrote that it was all because these subjects were incredibly hard for her, and she couldn't cope with the school program, so she apologized to her mother for that. The girl began to cry again and realized that she could not write something like this, for from 16 to 18, she had been the best student in the academy. She never expected her exam result to be a failure just because of her appearance, so it hit the girl hard. And Rosalia didn't know if she would have felt less grief if she had been able to pass another subject with honors. But she wanted more than anything to cry, to make her heart feel a little better. Shortly thereafter, she went out into the hallway and, opening the door to the room, asked if anyone was there. No one answered her, so she went inside to her old lab. No one was supposed to come in there, so she ran in and sat down on the couch and immediately cried to release her emotions. She really hoped that she could cry alone for a while in order to bring herself back to normal, and after a while she finally did calm down. The girl's eyes were very red because she had been crying for a long time, and she immediately wondered how long she had been in this lab. In fact, after crying over her broken heart, Rosalia even felt a little relieved. But at that moment, the door to the room suddenly opened, and a man came in. When she saw it, she jumped with surprise and was ready to scream, but she managed to restrain herself in time. This guy said it was actually his place and wondered what she was doing there. When Rosalia looked at the man, she was very surprised, for it was Jasper Conway who had come into her room. She couldn't figure out why she'd gone out with him all the time when she felt emotionally awful, and she wondered what he thought of her. He probably thought she was just a crybaby. Rosalia, turning away from him, said that she did not know they were his couches, and immediately added that in that case she would go away in order not to disturb him. When she started to walk right past him, she turned her head away so he wouldn't see her crying eyes, and thought to herself, no wonder. The old lab was still looking pretty good, so it was probably Jasper's place to hide. But then suddenly he stopped her, blocking her path, and said that he didn't actually mean she should leave. The girl kept trying to hide her face from him, pulling something out of her bag, and replied that she had only come to return his item. At the moment, she pulled out a clean tie and said he replied that he didn't need to buy anything. However, she washed it anyway, in order to return it. The girl also said that she just had no other choice, and she had to give it back right now. Jasper looked surprised at his tie, but thanked her for it. Rosalia immediately thanked God that he didn't start questioning why she was crying in the first place, and even assumed that he hadn't noticed it. But then suddenly he looked at her, and said that he actually wanted to talk to her about one very important thing. He walked over to the couch, and as he sat down on it, he heard her question. She immediately asked him what he wanted to talk to her about. Jasper smiled smugly and said that she had talked last time about wanting to repay him for his help. And in that time, he had already managed to think of something he wanted to get. The girl immediately started to worry and thought about how she wouldn't know what to do if he suddenly asked for something she couldn't afford. For right now, she had absolutely nothing, not even the slightest bit of money to buy anything, for she had spent it all on a lawyer for her father. Then, Jasper, with a smile on his face, asked if it was true that she was very good at her studies. The girl looked at him in surprise and said it was true. He said he had heard about it, and seeing the surprised look on her face, he asked, "Isn't it true?" Rosalia, thinking about it, said that she must be really good at studying. Then he said, smiling, that he needed additional training in magic ingredients. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked what it meant. Jasper replied that it was a required course in his subject for graduation, and he had just failed it. Rosalia was a little surprised when she heard that, but then she said that in that case, he just needed an introductory course in order to get a good grade and graduate, because he didn't even specialize in magical engineering, so he didn't need to study in depth much. The man said it was a beginner's course as it was. When she heard this, she wondered in surprise, could he really fail such an easy course? The man replied that it was indeed so. Rosalia then asked how he had managed to do it in the first place. But then suddenly she realized that she had said too much, and she was embarrassed about it, and so was Jasper. There was silence between them for a while, after which he coughed and said that he just hated numbers. The girl was glad that he was okay with it, and said that although she was raising all the responsibility, she still couldn't teach him. He looked at her in surprise and asked why that was so. She replied that she just probably wouldn't be at the institution for the next semester. Jasper was really surprised and asked where she would be. Rosalia, smiling nervously, said it was very complicated, but anyway, she could help him organize his notes for more productive study, so she asked if he had a notebook in which he had written on the subject. The man looked at her angrily and said he needed the lessons and wondered why she wouldn't be attending next semester after all. Rosalia didn't know how she should even explain all this to him, so she just stood there silent. She didn't know if she told him her whole situation, if Jasper would understand her, and if he could put himself in her shoes. She figured it was probably just another world to him that he would never understand. So Jasper asked that she just stay in school, and that was it. Rosalia, laughing, said it wasn't as simple as he said. She had her reasons. He stared at her for a while, after which he asked, "Is it because the tuition is so high?" When she heard that, she was very surprised and didn't expect him to ask such a question at all. It made her feel very uncomfortable. The girl was silent for a while, answering nothing, and he wondered if it was so difficult to solve this problem. She leaned back in her chair and said he would pay her tuition and she could use the money to cover her fees. At that moment, Rosalia thought that such a big deal for her and a problem for Jasper was really quite worthless. However, it was the best offer she had ever had. She didn't know why she hadn't said anything back to him until now, for this offer was simply gorgeous to her, and she felt that pride shouldn't be above perfect opportunities. So after some time of deliberation, she thanked him and told him that she would definitely return the remaining amount after graduation. Jasper wondered if it was really necessary. In her mind, she replied that it was absolutely necessary. Even if it took a long time, she still promised to pay back the full amount. And Jasper agreed and said that he had one condition. They could meet at this place as soon as the semester started. She looked at him in surprise and asked him if he really wanted to study there. He explained that it was a pretty good secret place to study. Rosalia looked around and saw that this room had everything she needed for lessons, and she agreed with him. Then suddenly he said with a smile, "Besides, she didn't want people to see them together and spread unnecessary rumors after all." When she heard that, she immediately felt uncomfortable. She couldn't believe that he was still thinking about the incident that morning. So she said, smiling, that it wasn't at all true that she didn't like it, just that it would probably be uncomfortable for herself as well as him. Jasper got up from his seat and said that in that case it was fine. Tuition would be calculated by that day, so she needn't worry. She, looking at him in surprise, asked, "Is it really going to be done so quickly?" He explained that there was no point in putting it off, and also asked if she had stopped crying at last. At that moment, she immediately noticed that it was real, and the tears stopped flowing. She didn't even realize when that might have happened. Then suddenly, he walked behind her and said that in that case, they would meet when the new semester started and he was leaving. Rosalia immediately turned to him and thanked him, but afterward wondered why he was helping her so much. Jasper stopped suddenly and said, smiling, that it was because she was an interesting person. And then he closed the door behind him and left. Rosalia was alone with these thoughts and didn't understand what he was talking about. Was it because she was different from the rest of her classmates? But then she suddenly thought that perhaps he had called her interesting because she looked somehow even ridiculous against the background of all the aristocrats. But the girl dismissed those thoughts rather quickly. See, at least now she wouldn't have to leave the academy because she couldn't pay for it. The girl could not believe that this had really happened, and also that she could continue her studies. She thought that was the only thing that mattered, that she would be able to get a decent education. Shortly thereafter, she returned to her room and realized that because of all that was going on, she needed to move to a new dorm room as well. That was why she was packing up the things that needed to be moved, when suddenly someone walked in and she immediately turned her attention to this girl. It was Rebecca Sherman, and looking at Rosalia, she asked her to hurry up. Her face was very unhappy. This girl was Baron Sherman's daughter and her roommate for the past year. Rebecca, laughing, said that she was finally free and would be living all alone in a room without the village commoner. This made her incredibly happy. But Rosalia, of course, was not surprised at such a reaction, for she hated it all the time. No matter what happened, Rebecca was always unhappy and scolded her roommate. Rebecca had a rather prickly temper that not everyone could handle, but even so, she was rather simple. So turning to her, Rosalia said her hair looked just perfect on this day. When the girl heard this, she indignantly asked what it was that she was saying, but then added that she, as an ordinary person, had pretty good eyesight, since she noticed and discerned such things. Rebecca, embarrassed, said it was actually a rare piece that had a limited edition from Madame McKeffer. In fact, Rosalia was really hoping that her new roommate would be a contentedly quiet person and not as difficult as Rebecca. And so some time passed from that moment on, and the girl's expectations began to crumble. As soon as she moved into her new room, she was immediately approached by a girl with pink hair. Her name was Brie Lorenza, and she said the girl could just call her Brie. Rosalia extended her hand in return and told her her name. They immediately shook hands for a long time. Brie said she'd moved into the room, so she didn't know much yet, and asked Rosalia to take care of her, since she was also new to the academy. Rosalia was a little surprised at this behavior, but said she would certainly do anything. When the handshake was finally over, the girl immediately realized that her life was apparently not going to be a quiet and peaceful one, and that disappointed her a little. Soon the two of them began to sort through their belongings to set up their room, and Rosalia wondered where her new roommate was from. Brie replied that she had studied abroad in the Bashkir Republic, and it was a pretty famous place for its art. Rosalia, when she heard this, asked, "Is it really so? After all, there's no art major at Butbenklik," so she didn't understand how the girl ended up at their place. Brie, waving her hands, replied that she really did. She realized that she had absolutely no talent for art, so she decided to get out of there and get a change of scenery. They immediately laughed when she said this, and then the girl, taking a special interest in her new neighbor, asked what could be said about her, where she was from in general, as well as what her major was. Rosalia immediately replied that she really liked studying magical engineering, so that was her specialty. At this moment, The girl took out a cookie from her backpack and asked if she wanted to eat it, and also asked who was the most popular guy in their academy. She was really very curious to know. The girl accepted the cookies, and as she began to eat, she immediately wondered who they might have the most popular one. Rosalia thought of the fact that if she had to choose someone very handsome, it would probably be Jasper Conway, so she immediately gave his name to the girl. When Brie heard this, she was overjoyed and said that it must be the son of some duke, for her last name sounded very attractive. Rosalia, putting her suitcase away in the closet, said that it was indeed so, but wondered why she was suddenly asking such a question about it. Her new roommate, smiling, said that of course she was asking about it because she wanted to date him. After all, if she's involved with the most popular guy in school, everyone will notice her. When Rosalia heard this, she was very much surprised. She had never thought that a girl could think like that. Then the girl inquired if by any chance she was close to this Jasper. She wanted to get to know him through her. Rosalia had already laid down on the bed at that time and said that they hardly knew each other, in fact, at which point she herself began to remember how he had asked for extra lessons from her. In fact, they shared the same path, but they were still not close friends. Brie, suddenly sitting up on the bed, said that it was a lot of fun. However, if anyone suddenly asked about whether they were close to each other, it was best to say that of course they were. She said that they should talk about the fact that they were now friends. Rosalia suddenly felt very uncomfortable and addressed the girl by her full name. Brie immediately corrected her, telling her to call her by her shortened name. She did so immediately, and then, apologizing, asked if she knew that Rosalie was only a commoner. In fact, she thought about the fact that she couldn't hide it forever, and assumed that surely this girl would start to hate her as much as Rebecca did. But Brie, opening her closet, said that of course she knew that, and thought she was in this academy because they didn't have a family crest. However, she herself has one, and would also like to give her a headband. And in the same second, the girl pulled out a beautiful headband with white lilies on it. She went over to Rosalia, and putting the headband on her head, said it looked just delightful, and it really did. The girl herself at this moment didn't realize that if she knew that Rosalia was a commoner, she still continued to communicate with her, and that meant that she must like her. Brie, smiling happily, said she knew it would look just adorable on her. Rosalia, at this moment looking at her, remembered the words of Professor Grandy, who had said that when a woman smiled, she should always cover her mouth with her hand. After all, that's what ladies do. But really, it's not always a mandatory rule, especially when you're as content as her new roommate at that moment. Brie took a seat next to the girl and asked if she could help her be with Jasper Conway. She even wondered if Rosalia thought it would be more natural if she helped them get acquainted. That way he might not even suspect anything in her opinion. She said that at least the girl knows Jasper after all, so there shouldn't be any problems. Rosalia replied that it was indeed true, but Jasper might not like Brie because everyone has different tastes. The girl then looked at her in surprise and asked, "Isn't he stunningly handsome?" This made Rosalia very uncomfortable. However, she said that he was really very handsome, so Brie smiled and said that in that case it would be okay. She felt that she could be completely guided by appearance. When the girl heard this, she immediately thought that maybe this would be a really good opportunity, and they would be a beautiful couple. So soon afterward, they set off in the direction of the academy and held hands directly like the truest of girlfriends. But as she walked past the other students, Rosalia noticed that everyone absolutely wouldn't take their eyes off the two of them, and that bothered her a lot. Brie, when she heard that, immediately smiled and asked if that was really true. Maybe it was because they were very pretty and cute. She also said that in spite of all this, that bow that was hanging on the girl's head looked just fine on Rosalia. But Rosalia said she felt out of place, and her friend replied that it actually looked very nice and fit her perfectly. Rosalie thought about the fact that Brie was completely unaware of how much attention she was drawing to her person in the first place, and assumed that it would be quite a challenge to go unnoticed now with her, as she had done before. Soon they finally went inside the academy, continuing to walk under his arm. The people there were also staring and turning around, whispering about them. As they walked a little farther on, Rosalia noticed Jasper nearby and immediately told her friend. The man also turned at that moment and saw them. Brie, who'd been watching him intently, said he was truly stunningly handsome. But then suddenly she also said that she thought he was looking not at her but at Rosalia, and she wondered why that was so. Jasper really didn't take his eyes off her, and the girl turned around and started to walk away and said it didn't mean anything. Brie, looking at him in love, said that in that case he was looking at her because she was so sweet and beautiful. Rosalia turned around and started to run away, telling her friend that she had to go to class right away before it was too late. So she wished her a good time at her first lecture. Soon the girl arrived just in time for Mineralogy class, and the first thing she will study in the new spring semester is this very subject. Mineralogy, which deals with minerals and mana stones, is a rather interesting subject, and Rosalia had never dealt with it before. And since mana stones determine the level of magic technique, it was an important topic for her especially. As soon as she entered the classroom, she saw that there were only a few people sitting there. She realized that this was also not a very popular subject in their schooling, but she thought that it would be even good, and she was looking forward to the beginning of the lesson already, because it seemed to her even something funny. And at that moment, while she was absorbed in her thoughts, she didn't notice Jasper sitting across the desk from her. She looked in his direction and was surprised. The girl, turning to him, inquired if he too had taken mineralogy as his subjects. He stared at Rosalia for a while, and afterward inquired if it was so strange-looking that he had chosen this subject. The girl realized that she had said something stupid, so she replied that it wasn't true at all. She just thought that mineralogy was not the most popular subject, so she didn't think he would come to it. The girl thought it was all rather odd and didn't understand why she kept bumping into this Jasper guy. And then the man said he had seen her with some stranger, and the girl immediately replied that it was her new roommate, Brie Illerins. When he heard this, he immediately began to smile, and Rosalia was very surprised at this behavior, not understanding what could have made him laugh so much. She was well aware that she'd promised the girl she'd help to get them together with Jasper, but she'd had this strange feeling even from the beginning that it wasn't a good idea. At that moment, her musings were interrupted by a professor of mineralogy whose name was Levi, and he came into the study to begin his lecture. The man was already quite old, so it was hard for him to even move around. But soon he came to his workplace, and, counting the people, there were only 10 of them. This made him a little upset. However, he said that all the students who had signed up for his course had already arrived, and he was happy to welcome them. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She didn't think that so few students had enrolled in this course. She was also surprised that it hadn't been closed at all, and she considered it a great stroke of luck. But when she looked to the side, she noticed that Jasper was sitting up and not taking his eyes off her. She didn't understand why that was. Then suddenly the man turned to her, and she even jumped up on the spot out of surprise, and then asked if he wanted to ask her something. He wondered if it looked like they were going to eat her or something, since she was so tense all the time when she was around. It actually bothered him incredibly much, so he asked about it. Rosalia wondered in surprise if she really had that expression on her face. In fact, she thought about the fact that it was all because he made her nervous, since he was above her in status. Jasper suddenly moved closer to her and said that she looked very anxious, and when he saw her with Brie, she seemed relaxed and unstressed. The girl was very surprised by such a remark and said that perhaps it was all because Brie was the exception. She felt uncomfortable with many people. Then the man, smiling, said that in that case he wanted her to act at least half comfortable around him. When she heard this, she was very surprised and didn't understand what he was even talking about. But then the teacher suddenly called his name, and he raised his hand up and said that it was him, and he was present. The girl was still glimpsing him, and didn't realize if he was trying to hint that he wanted to get closer in familiarity. The instructor then called her name, and the girl immediately put her hand up and said that she was also present. And afterward, she sank back into her thoughts and couldn't believe that Jasper could consider them friends because she'd told Brie that they were just that. Quite some time had passed since then, and the lesson was finally over when the bell rang. The teacher said that they did a very good job during this time because they were able to learn the theory. So next time they will do a group project to reinforce the material. Then he added that that was the end of it and they could leave. In fact, it had been 2 whole hours since the lesson had started, and all the students were incredibly tired. You see, the lecture was boring for them, and they had been assigned a group project, which they disliked more than anything else in the world. And Rosalia at that moment sat incredibly satisfied and even tired. She thought it had been a very productive class, and she was glad that she had gotten a place in Professor Levis's class. She looked at her notes and thought of this time well spent even in the days to come. She then looked to the side to see who else was left and noticed that Jasper was sitting up and even falling asleep. She turned to him and asked if he was all right, for he looked very tired indeed. The man immediately cheered up and said that he was really fine, so she shouldn't worry. Rosalia still realized that he was behaving strangely, for he hadn't even brought his bag to class with him, and taking notes was very necessary for mineralogy. They were the last ones out of the classroom, and the girl, closing the door, thought about the fact that despite all of this, Jasper had given her the opportunity to stay at the academy. Even if they didn't get to know each other personally, she should still be friendly to him. The man came forward and she caught up with him, tapping him on the back and asking him to stop. Jasper looked at the girl in surprise, and Rosalia said that she had noticed that he hadn't written any notes at all, so she wondered if he would like to take her notes. The man, smiling, said he didn't need it, but thanked her for it. He also said he didn't understand them at all. She said there was no problem and stayed behind him. But she was actually surprised, for it would be so much better if Jasper found joy in the subject and in learning all its intricacies. Soon, after thinking about various things, she caught up with him and told him that if he saw monostones being refined, he might find it interesting and even want to study the subject further. Jasper suddenly stopped and looked directly at her, wondering if she really liked monostones that much. Rosalia continued on her way, and he said her face always changes for the better when she starts talking about them. The girl was a little surprised at such a compliment, but smiled and said that indeed, the 2 things she loves are magic engineering and mineralogy. She studies them the most and is willing to learn more and more new things. They walked in silence for a while, and then the man asked what she thought about tutoring and magical engineering. The girl smiled and replied that it sounded very good on Friday nights, and she certainly agreed. But that's when she heard someone call her name, and as soon as she turned around, she saw that Brie was already hugging her very tightly. She said she'd missed her all this time. Rosalia looked at her in surprise and didn't know how to react to this at all. And the girl herself at that moment noticed that her friend was not alone, but together with Jasper. And she asked why they were going together. She shifted her gaze from the girl to the guy in surprise and asked what was even going on. Brie tried not to make an indignant expression on her face and wondered how that could have even happened. Rosalia, thinking, said that it so happened that they were now in the same class. The girl laughed when she heard this and said that she could see it perfectly well. She then extended her hand forward to the man and said that her name was Brie and Lawrence, and she was very pleased to meet him. She also said that they would probably see each other quite often now, so she thought it would be nice to get to know each other better. Jasper didn't even respond to her hand in any way and asked what made her think the 2 of them would see each other often. The girl explained that she wanted to be friends with him. The man replied that he understood that. However, he didn't really plan to be friends with the sad intruder, namely the youngest daughter of the Lawrence family. Brie, smiling, told Jasper that if he said it, he would only make it worse, so she didn't see fit to take the subject any further. After this, no one said anything. They only looked at each other angrily, as if they were playing a game of peepers. and Rosalia felt very awkward at this moment and did not know what she should do now. Brie, as if coming to her senses, put a hand on her friend's shoulder and asked if she could take the rose with her. Jasper looked at her in surprise and asked why she was even asking him about it. But the girl said nothing, said goodbye to him, and also said that they would see each other a little later. The man did not reply anything to this, but only sighed heavily and thought about the fact that this girl had a very bad temper. And to top it all off, the only thing that can drive this not-so-nice character is an exquisite beauty that outshines everything else. Rosalia felt just awful as she followed her friend, for the atmosphere was very tense. And when she looked at them, she immediately assumed that perhaps they would not get along. And so some time passed from that moment, and when lunchtime came, all the students gathered in a special hall to eat and gain strength. Brie was very excited, so she immediately ran over to Rosalia, who was sitting quietly at her desk eating her lunch. The girl saw her plate and wondered if she was on a diet or something like that. She also added that if she continued to eat so little and study so hard, she wouldn't be able to stand it anytime soon. Rosalia, smiling, said that she had been in the habit of eating a little bit at a time for quite some time, which was why she had poured so little on herself. Brie, who was eating her steak, transferred some of the food to her friend's plate, saying that she should definitely eat more, because you can't just eat salads alone. And not long after that, the girl had several pieces of meat and sausage on her plate. So now, there were more than just vegetables. Rosalia smiled immediately. She was very pleased that Brie constantly reminded her of her grandmother from her hometown, for the latter had always taken great care of her nutrition. She remembered very often how her grandmother poured as much food as she could into her food so that she would eat and grow up to be a healthy girl. Even though they didn't have much money for that, they still gave most of it to the child. Grandma's explanation was that she was in a growth period, so she shouldn't be so overly picky about what she ate. Rosalia, of course, when she was little, liked it all immensely because the dishes were always delicious and at the same time healthy. So she said that she would always eat well to make her grandmother happy. So the moment her friend took care of her, she smiled broadly and thanked Brie for it was a pleasure indeed. She thought of Brie looking like a really good friend who would care and be able to be supportive at any time. So they continued eating their lunch in silence. But then suddenly they heard some noise, so Rosalia immediately turned to the side to see what was going on. Then near the table where there's a lot of food that they have to choose and eat, she saw Jasper and was very surprised, just like everyone else. Brie wondered, as she followed her friend's thoughtful gaze, what had brought this young master to the dining room this day. The girl replied that she herself was stunned by the news and had no idea. In fact, despite the fact that this Academy's restaurant is famous for its exquisite flavors, Jasper had never been there. All the time the guy was eating somewhere in separate places. Some even said that his refined taste could never be satisfied by such a simple restaurant meal in a canteen. Perhaps because of this, everyone pretended to eat while their attention was focused on Jasper. When he appeared in the dining room, it was a big shock to the others. In fact, Rosalia, like everyone else, was only interested in one thing, where Jasper would sit. So, after wandering between the tables for a bit, the man walked over and placed his plate, filled with various meats, vegetables, and even a few fruits on the table. Pulling back a chair that was not far from Rosalia and her friend, he took his seat, and the girl, seeing this, was simply amazed that he had actually decided to sit next to them. Brie, when she saw that, immediately began to smile slyly. She thought about sitting next to him and sat down across from the guy. Whoa, Rosalia felt very uncomfortable and did not understand why, of all the places in the dining room, he had chosen the one where she was sitting. So she decided that she should eat very quickly and leave as soon as possible. The girl immediately continued her meal, but then she suddenly heard Jasper's voice asking if she was eating normally. The girl immediately turned her head to him and wondered if he was addressing her. He replied that it was quite right. You see, her portion was too small, so he wasn't sure if she was all right. Then Brie, who hadn't even been asked, stepped in. She said she thought so too, and added that she fed her rabbit at home more than her friend did. Then suddenly Jasper said that this plate looked much smaller than what the rabbit could eat. Brie said that of course he was right, and she really needs to eat more. That's why her wrists are very thin, and it's probably even hard for her to hold a pen. She asked the girl to eat more, and again put a few pieces of meat on her plate. Rosalia thanked her immediately and began to eat. And she herself thought at that moment that it seemed to her as if they had come to this academy together and had known each other all along. In fact, it was the first time a nobleman had finally visited the restaurant, and there was also a transfer of a student from the Republic itself. And they were all sitting at the same table. But next to them was a scholarship student who expected to fall off his scholarship, but in the end was able to stay afloat and stay in academia. She looked at her plate full of food, and it even seemed to her that now she had two people who were very much like her grandmother, for they were very kind to her and caring. In fact, Rosalia wanted to live in peace and tranquility, and this incident would again produce quite a few rumors around her person. She realized that people had already started spreading various news about Jasper walking into the dining hall and taking a seat next to the commoner, and rumors were spreading very quickly in the academy, as they always did. Naturally, the hot topic at that moment was the three people who were the only ones in the restaurant. They sat all together and attracted the most attention to themselves. Rosalia pondered on the topic that the rumors must be asking what the connection was between Brie and Jasper. After all, they sat across from each other, and surely there must have been something between them. She also thought about the fact that there would probably be a lot of people wondering what the average Rosalie Bell was even doing to them, and the side that gave her the most support for the rumors was the next. Rosalia did not know whether it was possible that Brie, who had returned from the Republic, had met Jasper during the interval, for they were behaving rather strangely. In addition, Jasper is a conservative nobleman who values traditional legality and believes that his son would not be pleased or benefited by seeing a lower-class woman. Thus, the rumor will naturally lean toward two lovers who are having a secret affair behind their parents' backs. And of course, Rosalia Bell will be considered just a smokescreen to keep their secret romance alive. All people will probably assume she's just a front to distract everyone from the secret business going on behind the backs of others. Rosalia had been thinking about it most of the day, and the class she had come to this afternoon seemed very predictable, so she was already prepared for all the rumors. However, at least for her, it was a relief that the rumors were lumping those two together and hardly affecting her, because things could have turned out much worse. In any case, she finally had the day when she should have her first extra class for Jasper, so she was going to go straight to the lab after class was over. They were due to have their first class at 8 o'clock in the evening, so she realized she had to arrive a little early to get the study materials ready. But the moment she thought about Jasper, she wasn't sure if he'd even forgotten about their arrangement, and she really hoped he hadn't, because she wouldn't want to waste the evening just waiting for him. As it slowly began to get darker outside, Rosalia, who had gone into the room to get her special textbooks, had already started to head for the lab they had agreed to meet in. But the girl was very tense, for all the streetlights were out on the path she was climbing. She had heard that as many as 3 construction workers had died during the renovation of the annex. Some people also said that there was a ghost of a man who had fallen from the 4th floor, a human head floating in the air. She also thought about the fact that these people talk about a ghost with brain fluid wandering the halls and pestering everyone who passes by. And by the time she finally reached the stairs, she was trembling with fear. She knew it was just a fantasy, but when she walked alone down the dark corridor, the fantasy became reality. Rosalia kept trying to convince herself that ghosts and various spirits were unreal, but soon she was so badly frightened that she dropped all her things and curled up in a ball and began to cry. Jasper, who was already in the office, immediately came out to see what all the commotion was about, and when he saw her sitting on the floor, he wondered with a smile on his face what she was even doing there. Deep, the girl, hearing his voice, immediately calmed down a little, and when she looked at him, she couldn't believe her happiness. All her eyes were tearful, but at least she stopped shaking. He invited her into the room, and she immediately sat down at the table. He sat down on the sofa next to her and wondered why she had screamed earlier and dropped all her things. Rosalia felt very uncomfortable, so she decided to avoid the subject by saying that she didn't think so. Surely he must have either heard it or it was someone else. She realized that it was all too silly, so she couldn't tell him what she was afraid of. She also didn't understand what he was doing in the office because she had arrived much earlier than the agreed time. Rosalia started to pull out some textbooks and actually realized that she hadn't expected to see him so early. Jasper, still smiling, wondered why she was so scared, and seeing her expression, added that she was even more scared than he had realized. The girl tried with all her might to change the subject of conversation and wondered why he had come much earlier than they had agreed. He lay back on the couch and said he had just fallen asleep. When she saw him in that position, she said she could imagine it. Rosalia then went back to cracking open her textbooks and preparing everything she needed for class. When everything was ready, she turned to the man and said they could begin. Jasper looked at the workstation in surprise and asked, "Are they really starting class already?" The girl replied that everything was absolutely correct. She thought that they both came early so they could finish quickly and leave before the scheduled time and already rest. He sighed heavily, saying he didn't want that. He wanted some more rest right now, and he had no desire to study for now. When Rosalia heard this, she was very surprised, but she did not argue with him, so she sat in silence for a long time, looking at the wall. She felt very uncomfortable and didn't realize if they were going to sit like this until as late as 8 o'clock in the evening.